In the last video, we learned how to create a UV map that tells the software where to put the textures on your object. In this video, we're going to look at how to assign different textures and images to this map. So, first thing you're going to want to do, if you have not already, just File, Open. If it was the last thing you opened, it should be under Recent Files. If not, just open Scene. And I saved mine under Documents, Maya Demo, and Scenes. The one I named last time was Hammer Texture. So open that. If you're using a student software, it'll ask you if you want, well, it'll remind you. Okay, select your object. So the first thing we're going to look at is the Hypershade editor. The Hypershade is how Maya assigns textures and properties of the surface of an object to an object. So under Windows, Rendering Editors, because it's used in rendering, Hypershade, and this window will pop up. By default, everything is Lambert 1. We're going to create a new material. To do that, you want to go under Maya. And to begin with, we're going to make a Fong E. Different materials have different properties, and different rendering engines prefer certain or only work with some materials. There are some that will work for, depending on what render engines you have installed, will pop up. You might see other things down here. But we're going to work with Fongs, Fong Es, Lamberts, Blends. For now, those are really the only ones we're going to worry about. Okay, so the properties of this new material, as soon as you clicked on Fong E, you created the material right here. We're going to call this Hammer. And we're going to select the hammer, and it's important that you don't click on the new material, but right-click on it and assign material to selection. It doesn't look any different, but now if we change the properties of the hammer, you have to select your material, change the properties of your material. You can do this in a number of ways. If you just want to change the color all over the object, you can just click on the color and up will pop up your swatch book with your color mixing parameters or colors that you've used recently. Up here, I'm just going to make it yellow or green so you can see it. All right, and as you can see, my hammer is now green. If I select my object over under Attribute Editor, at the very end, we're starting to load a lot of garbage in here that we don't want. So with the object selected, you want to make sure you do this before you animate your object. But once you're done modeling, go under Edit, Delete by Type, and History. And now all of the changes have been saved to this object, and your undo history won't work anymore, but it's more stable and there's less parameters in the attribute editor to keep track of. So if you look on Hammer, which is the texture, we have our color. You can also change the transparency. These are specific for the type of material that you created. In Fong E, you have the type Fong E, you have the color. You can change the transparency, the ambient color. Ambient color is what color it will appear even if there are no lights shining on it. Imagine it as it sort of glows in that color all the time. Incandescence is it's actually emitting light in whatever color this would be. Bump map is like a bump, like a texture on your surface. If your surface is made out of sand, you'll have, sort of like a static looking bump map. If it's made out of glass, it'll be flat, like all one color, gray. Diffuse, that's the color that the object naturally is. Normally we start out at about 80%. Translucent is how much light comes through your object. Not to be confused with transparency, which is actually seeing through your object. Translucent is sort of like foggy glass. You know, if your object, or like when you hold a piece of plastic up to a light source, it emits or lets light through it if there's light behind it in whatever color. Like if you had a red plastic object and you held it up to a light source, you'll see red through it. So that's sort of what your translucence is. You have translucence depth and translucence focus. Don't worry about those yet. Specular shading, that's sort of like the shininess of it. It's like a reflection, but it doesn't actually reflect the scene, but it will put highlights for the lights that are in your scene. Reflectivity is how shiny it is. Like you would see, if it was reflectivity was all the way over at 1, this would be like a perfect mirror that reflected 100% of the light in the room. So like if your reflectivity was set to 1, this would be shinier than the shiniest, metal that there is. Usually reflectivity, even if it's a mirror, isn't above about 80-90%. Reflected color, sometimes if you hold something up, it will reflect in a specific color, like dichroics will reflect in one color, and it might transmit a completely different color. So it like tints the reflection in a specific color if you want that. Special effects, your object can glow. Ray trace, in video games, we'll get into this later. This is used mostly with the default render engines. Don't worry about that yet. Ray tracing has things like refraction. If your object, like when you see glass, even if it doesn't reflect, even if it didn't reflect, it bends the light that's moving through it. That's what refraction is. Refractive index depends on the material. You can look up the refractive index of different materials just by Googling it. Like if you Google the refractive index of glass, diamonds, it'll give you a number, and it'll usually be between 0 and 1. Refraction limit is just how many times it iterates that in the render engine. Don't worry about that yet. Surface thickness is just how thick it is. Don't worry about all this stuff yet. Reflection limit, that's how many times the processor will process a reflection off of that object. So, for example, if you had two mirrors sitting in front of each other, how many times it bounces back and forth is how many times, this is how many times they'll process that. Okay, so those are the attributes of a Phong-E. Let's look at some of the others. Again, under Window, Rendering Editors, Hypershade to pull up your Hypershader. And let's look at Blend. Blend's a lot like a Phong-E. It's got a lot of the same parameters, but there's this specular parameter which changes how the highlight that is reflected off of your object looks. Eccentricity is just how sharp it is. Like a really low amount of eccentricity would be very shiny. So like your reflection of lights off of your object will be fine points. A higher eccentricity is sort of like if it was a little more rough on the surface. Reflectivity is, again, how much it reflects of what's in the room. You want to watch this. By default, they're all at 50%. I usually turn them all the way down to 0 and add it later on if I wanted. Bump map, again, it's a bump texture. Ray tracing does the same thing. Okay, you have some 2D textures and some 3D textures. 3D textures, one you might be interested in is wood. It doesn't look a lot like wood, and there are better ways to do it. But if you want to add a 3D texture to an object, you can do it with this. Like if you If you go over here to our hammer, and if you click here on this checkerboard, this says, okay, I want to assign a specific file to, this is the color of the object. This would be like if your object was made out of wood, this would be the wood grain texture of your object. So you click right here, and this window will come up. You can go to File and point it to a specific image, like a JPEG or a PNG, or you can go down and use like wood, for example. This puts on our hammer a 3D texture of wood, and this is a sample of it. So if you go and look at your object, it's important to know that you won't see a preview of your texture. It'll give you a preview of colors, but you won't see any of the image textures until you go under Shading and turn on Hardware Texturing. Okay? Now you see a preview. Honestly, this isn't a very good preview. If I render this, a quick way to render our scene, right here, this will give you a more accurate view of what that wood texture does. Okay? So there's our wood texture on our object.